Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I thought I would have a chat about reading as a writer. So if you don't know, as well as being a booktuber, I'm also a writer. I write historical novels. I have had 2 books published, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall and The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, and I'm working on a 3rd at the moment. And I have been thinking for a while that I would like to do a video about sort of reading and being a writer and how being a writer affects my reading or impacts my reading. I was thinking of this topic lately for a few different reasons. One is because I did the reading shifts tag a few weeks ago. And I spoke quite a lot in that video about how my career as an editor, because I'm also an editor, has impacted my reading. But I kind of forgot to talk about how my writing career and the fact that I also write has impacted my reading. I also got a comment on one of my videos a few weeks ago from someone else who writes and reads, talking about how they were currently reading books for research and reading books like in comparative areas to what they were working on and how much they were enjoying that and kind of enjoying studying the craft of what they were reading. And I also enjoy doing that, and that also made me think about this. And then also I had a very writing heavy month in February. I didn't read as many books as usual, partly because I was spending a lot more of my free time writing than usual. Writing sort of occupies a strange space in my time management because it is, on the one hand, part of my work. I am a published author. It's part of my job is being a writer, but also it is my favorite thing to do. So it is also my hobby. Also, sometimes the time you need to give to writing is not the time I can assign it in my day, if you see what I mean. So I ended up spending just all my free time in February writing rather than reading, which is how I often spend my free time. I did read some books, but less than usual. And that was also making me think about how writing impacts reading. And I feel like I felt more like a writer than a reader in February, whereas usually I probably feel more like a reader who also writes, if you see what I mean. I always find it interesting talking to other writers and talking to them about how they read and how their writing impacts their reading and vice versa. Obviously, most writers read because the main reason I think why you want to write a book, a fiction book at least, tends to be because you love fiction books and you want to be part of creating that yourself. And I think a lot of writers love reading and love to talk about books and often write in the genres of things they like to read. But I know, for example, some writers who don't read at all while they're working on a first draft and have months in the year where they write and months in the year when they read. I also know some writers who don't read the genre they write while they're working on a first draft. They only read genres, other genres, not the genre they're working on, so that they don't get distracted. And then I sort of know people who are the opposite, who only read the genre they write in, and that's the only genre they really care about, which I always find quite interesting. So I thought I would talk today a bit about sort of how my writing influences what I read and also how my writing influences how I read. And maybe this will be interesting, I don't know. I feel like this is a slightly random topic, but there we go. In terms of how my writing influences what I read, I would say there are a few areas that it influences. One is sort of historical secondary source research. I write historical fiction. I write novels set in the Victorian period. So I therefore do lots of reading about the Victorian period. And I read a lot of secondary source material, by which I mean non-fiction work written in the 21st century, or I suppose in the 20th century, about the 19th century, about the Victorian period. And I read quite a lot of historical secondary source material for my writing. The majority of the books I read, in this category, I don't really end up talking about on BookTube because I often read a chapter or 2 chapters or the introduction and a few select bits, and I'm not reading the thing all the way through. Or it's so specific that I feel like it wouldn't be interesting to talk about on my channel, or I don't want to talk about it on my channel yet because it's too clear what I'm writing about. For example, I'm working on a book at the moment, and I have not said very much about it, and I won't yet, but hopefully I will soon. So there's been books I've read for research for that are really specific, and therefore I haven't spoken about on this channel. But there are also books I've read for that project, for this novel that are much less specific, and I also think would interest people who watch my videos, and then I have spoken about them. I also do quite a lot of historical primary source research, so I'm reading books from the Victorian period to help me with my writing. So let's separate this into non-fiction and fiction. I read quite a lot of like sources from the Victorian period, you know, diaries and conduct books. Conduct books are really interesting, you know, advice books, and sort of like works in non-fiction from the time. For example, when I was researching for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, some of this book takes place in a brewery. There's like a brewery that's one of the main characters runs, and so I read lots of Victorian guides on how to brew, which was fun. I know so much about brewing considering how much I don't like beer, but anyway, I really enjoy reading all the primary sources, and again, that's not something I really speak about on this channel. I suppose I kind of read like Anne Lister's diaries for research, and I felt that they had a much broader appeal, and I read them word for word, so I did talk about them on this channel, but in general I would say when I read primary sources I don't tend to talk about them here. I have made a video before about like my historical research process in general, so if you might find that interesting, I will leave that down below. And then, as I said, I also read some primary sources that are fictional, and I suppose this is the thing that influences my like reading for pleasure the most, and where I'm not like necessarily reading these books strictly for research, but what I'm writing would definitely influence what I'm reading, if that makes sense. As I said, I write historical fiction set in the Victorian period, and reading Victorian literature is like a massive part of my writing, both for research in terms of like everyday life and little detail. There's lots of like things that are mentioned in novels that are so specific you wouldn't really like come across them in a non-fiction book, but also I think reading fiction from a time period is really, really helpful for helping you capture the language and tone. And I definitely find that reading Victorian literature really helps me write books set in a Victorian period and make the characters sound like they're Victorians. Like the best way for me to capture a Victorian voice is to read Victorian novels. And I would say that like the specific book project I'm working on does tend to like focus my particular Victorian reading for a few months or years or whatever, either to like the decade of the Victorian period that I'm writing something set in, or to specific books or like a specific topic I'm exploring and I therefore want to read. And I often end up reading like books specifically published in the year of the book I'm set. So for example, when I was writing The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, this book is set in 1841, and I needed a book to be mentioned that was published in 1841 because I wanted some of the characters in the book to be having a conversation in a bookshop about a new release. But I don't like to mention a book in passing that I haven't read, because that feels wrong. So therefore I read Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton in order to mention it in The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, because it was published in the right year. And I really loved it. Would highly recommend Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton. Great coming of age story. But that was yeah, I guess that's an example of my writing, like very specifically guiding my reading to a very specific book. So the fact I write books set in the Victorian period has quite a big influence on my reading of classics, and obviously makes me read more Victorian classics, though I would anyway because I love them. You know, I'm writing books set in the Victorian period because I'm fascinated by the Victorian period. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. But of course, what I write also influences like what I read in terms of modern books. And I would say there are sort of two strands to that. One is sort of comparative research in terms of genre. You know, do I read more historical fiction because that's what I write? Maybe, but also I write historical fiction because I really love historical fiction, and I read a lot of historical fiction because I really love it. So the correlation is kind of complicated there. I guess I do read quite a lot of like 19th century set historical fiction, but again, is that because I'm writing in that time period, or is that more just because that's my favorite time period to have anything to do with? I guess also I get sent more review copies of historical fiction than other genres because that's like what I'm writing in, and that's the area that I'm working in as an author. So that probably also influences my reading a little bit. And I guess also like not just thinking about historical fiction more broadly, but also about subgenres. I think I probably read more like gothic historical fiction when I was writing The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, because that one is quite gothic, which Montgomery Hearst is not. And I think I probably did read more like gothic books when I was working on this. And I've definitely over the last few years been reading more of the subgenre of historical fiction that I'm currently writing a book in. Sorry to be vague. Maybe I should have just made this video like in 3 months' time when I have told you more about the book I'm working on. Anyway, it's fine. Yes, the other thing I sometimes do is sort of comparative research that is less about genre and more about like style or form. I've been reading a few books lately, sort of specifically looking at writing style and form rather than genre, which has been really fun. And it's something that I find really interesting. I'm always interested in how books are written and the specific like form or voice or style that an author chooses. And that might be as simple as like reading more books written in first person when I'm writing in first person, or more books in third person when I'm writing in third person, or more books in present tense when I'm writing in present tense, etc., whatever it might be. I would say, as a writer, like someone who quite likes to write in different styles. I personally think that different stories need different styles, and I quite like adopting slightly different tones in different books. So like Hartwood Hall is first person past tense, and Montgomery is third person past tense. The thing I'm writing at the moment is in present tense and has some other stylistic differences. And when I write short stories, I often vary my style and my perspective and tense, and I quite enjoy doing that and find it quite fun. And for me, that's like part of the pleasure of writing. So I definitely sometimes read books because I'm like looking at how an author handles a particular style or how an author creates narrative voice. And that's definitely something I sometimes like pick up books specifically to look at, but also sometimes I'm just like keeping an eye out for as I read, I guess. Which kind of leads me into the next part of this video, where I wanted to talk about like how I think writing influences how I read. I think there are definitely times when I am like really aware of the skill it takes to write something, and sometimes that can be quite specific. So for example, I always think of Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, which I just think is like the best character study ever written. Like if I were talking to any people who were writing and who are like at the beginning of writing, or anyone who was like struggling with characterization, I would tell them to read Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, because I think it is just like a perfect character study and such a like wonderful example of fantastic characterization and really complex characterization. And I feel like Mr. Loverman is one of those books that I loved as a reader, but I also loved as a writer, because I was like, oh, this is just like top-notch characterization, I guess. And I remember when I read The Great Divide by Cristina Henriquez a couple of years ago, thinking like, what a perfect example this is of third-person omniscient narration, which sounds like a really specific compliment to give to a book. It's also a great book in other ways, but I really like third-person omniscient narration, but it's quite like out of fashion now. I would say that like close third-person, third-person perspective, but following just one character or just one character per chapter, like that is the norm now. Though third-person omniscient used to be really common, and a lot of classics do use third-person omniscient, where it's a third-person perspective and like moving between characters, dipping in and out of people's heads within one scene. And The Great Divide is a really good example of a modern book using third-person omniscient narration, dipping in and out of the heads of different characters in a really, really good way. And I just was really impressed by that. And also, like, again, I have it in my head as a good example because I quite like experimenting with third-person omniscient narration, but also it's quite like old-fashioned now, and it is quite hard to pull off in general, and so I always keep The Great Divide in my head because of that. I was also wondering whether my own like writing strengths and weaknesses affect my taste in books. For example, I would say that in general I prefer books with a stronger plot, or that are more plot driven, and I often find like really literary fiction without a plot not very interesting. And I wonder if that's partly because I, as a writer, naturally find plot really hard to do. Like, characterization and writing nice sounding sentences comes much more easily to me than plotting, and I find plotting quite hard, which is not to say I don't think I can achieve it, but usually like I need like 7 drafts of a book before I'm happy with the plot, whereas I'm pretty happy with the characters like early on usually. And I wonder if that influences my reading taste because I like have more respect for a well-crafted plot than a well-crafted sentence, because I feel like it's not actually that hard to write a pretty sentence, but it is really hard to do a really good plot. So I feel like maybe that influences my reading taste because I have like more respect for the good plotters, because that's like my own weakness, and maybe because I personally find characterization like comes more naturally to me, definitely the plot. Maybe I have like less patience with poor characterization in books. I don't really know, but I was thinking about it and found it quite interesting to reflect on like whether my own writing strengths and weaknesses affect my reading taste. And I also think that novelty sometimes like has more weight with me, like the first time I encounter it. Let me give you an example. I remember the first time I read something about Angela Carter, and also the first time I read something about Ali Smith. and was just like really, really blown away and impressed because I didn't like know you were allowed to do that with words, I suppose, or with punctuation, etc. I didn't know you were allowed to break the rules like that when I was in my teens and early 20s and first encountered these writers who are very experimental. And I was really impressed and thought, you know, that's really cool that you can do that and that you can break the boundaries like that. But I feel like with Ali Smith, for example, I just ran out of steam with her books like really quickly. I read one and loved it, and then I read another and was like, this is kind of fine, but I feel like the style was getting in the way of the plot. And then I read a couple more and I just wasn't really getting on with her books at all, because I think once I had encountered the novelty of her writing style and been like, oh, that's really interesting, that I didn't actually have anything more to get out of her books. And for me, she is one of those like literary fiction writers where the style gets in the way of the substance, and I kind of can't really understand what she's trying to say because it's told in such an unusual way. But that is very much personal taste, and I can see that what she's doing is really impressive. And I can respect it, but also it's not really my cup of tea. So I guess in a way, maybe as a writer, you're less likely to judge a book harshly because you kind of are aware of all the work that's gone into it, and also because you might be able to respect what a writer has done that's interesting, even if it's not your thing. But I guess on the flip side, you also like kind of know how a book gets made, and so that takes away some of the like magic to a certain extent. I don't know. And I also don't know if this is actually more about being an author or being an editor. But like knowing how difficult it is for books to get created and knowing like how many edits so many books go through and things like that, like that does slightly shift the reading experience. You know, I did English literature and history at university, and in the English literature half of my degree we were often encouraged to do close reading and be sort of like picking apart one sentence that an author had written and being like, why did they choose this word and this word? And as a writer I would kind of sit there being like, maybe they didn't think about it very much, maybe they just thought it sounded nice. Yes, they were aware of the connotations of this word, but maybe they weren't like trying to do this complicated thing that all these professors are really into it. Maybe they just wrote it and thought it sounded good and they were trying to move on with the story. Like, I do think sometimes the way books are taught at university and the way people talk about classics especially is like authors were like magical mystical beings that are sacred, but they were just people writing books. I'm trying to remember what the specific example was and I can't, but I definitely remember studying a book at some point in my university career where there was something that seemed like an error, and a professor was trying to talk about why this is purposeful and what this might mean. And I think maybe it was just an error. Like, I think maybe the author just made a mistake. I'm really annoyed that I can't remember the specific example, but I do think that, like, putting books up on a pedestal is probably lessened by being a writer yourself. Although, I think on the flip side, sometimes I read a book and I'm like, here's an author, this person's an author, I'm also an author. And sometimes I read a book and I'm like, is what I do really the same thing as what they do? I remember reading Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon last year and just thinking to myself, like, should I even be called an author? Because what I do is not comparable to what Ferdia Lennon is doing. Like, Glorious Exploits is just like on such a different level. Like, sometimes I read a book and I'm like, I understand how this book was written and I understand how this came into creation. And sometimes I read a book and it's just magic. And like, Glorious Exploits is a good example of that. One of those books that I don't know how Ferdia Lennon did that. I don't understand how it was possible to write something that good, especially for your debut novel. That's just, you know, putting the rest of us to shame. And, you know, I like my books and I hope to write many books in my career, and I am proud of the things I have written and I think they're good. And sometimes I read books and I feel like they are also books and I am someone who writes books. And sometimes I read books and I think this is a whole different other magical thing that is not what I'm doing. This is just so beyond. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, as someone who is a writer and a reader and also an editor, I guess, like, I understand the workings and the mechanics and I know how books come into being and what like a strain it is for books to come into being, and I can often see the workings, as it were, and I can see the craft and what's gone into it, and I can see what like tools and tricks have been used, I guess, to a certain extent, but also like the magic definitely remains, especially for books that I really, really love. And I think maybe my favourite books are the books that, like, the magic really, really remains, and I read it and think, goodness, how did they do this? Like, goodness, what a genius this author is. Like, how did they do this? I'm just in awe. I don't think I will ever write anything this good. And that's like a really exciting feeling. And that's what books like Glorious Exploits do. So I guess that is like a really nice part of being a writer and a reader. So maybe being a writer like takes away some of the magic in some areas, but also like when the magic remains, it's even more powerful. I feel like this has been a very rambly video and I don't know if it made any sense, but I hope it has been interesting. I will leave some links down below to my books if you'd like to know more about them. Like I said, I've had 2 novels published. The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, which is out in the US as well as the UK, and then The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, which was only published in the UK, but you can get a copy if you are in the US or Canada through Blackwell's. And Blackwell's is quite good for international shipping generally, depending on where in the world you are. Blackwell's might be a good bet. I will leave some links down below, and I'll also leave a link to where you can buy some of my short stories on my Patreon if anyone's interested in that. And yeah, do let me know down in the comments if you write and if that changes your reading, or like how that impacts your reading, both like what you read and how you judge what you're reading, I guess. Because I feel like this could be an interesting topic, although I feel like this was mostly just a ramble that wasn't very coherent, but there we go. Okay, that is all from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.